All right, let's begin. So first, we're going to do some housekeeping here, and you can see the agenda on the screen. But please, if you have questions, there's a Q&A or chat feature if you want to submit questions. If you submit anonymously, we won't be able to follow up with you with a question if we're not able to get to it during the Q&A portion of the webinar at the end of the hour. So if you do want to follow up, please include your name in your submission, and we'll follow up after the webinar if we're not able to get to it during the Q&A session. We will also send out the deck after the session is over, and we do have the live transcript feature enabled for this webinar. So if you want to use it, please turn on the setting in your Zoom toolbar now. Okay, so we are Syndio. I'll talk a little bit about us as an organization for those that may not be familiar. So we're a leading workplace equity analytics platform, and we work with all the companies you see here on the screen, plus many, many more confidentially. And across over 300 customers, we analyze data for more than 7.4 million employees across the globe. And what differentiates us is the mix of both sophisticated technology solutions and expert advice in supporting spanning legal best practices, custom statistical analyses, and reporting and communications. And we're also really proud to share some news that Syndio was named number 20 on Fortune's 2023 Change the World list of 50 companies that are both for-profit and for-purpose. We're alongside that list with organizations like Apple, Patagonia, Walmart, and Microsoft. So really proud to be in good company with them. Okay, so today you're going to be hearing from me. I'm Chris Martin. I'm a labor economist by trade, and I focus on issues of identity-based exclusion in the workplace. So that includes things like pay equity and opportunity equity, but I've also looked into things like salary history disclosures and the impact that those laws have on job offers and links between employee engagement and compensation. And I'm joined by my colleague, Vanessa Lynskey. For nearly 15 years, Vanessa has taken a user-centered approach to understanding inequities and building innovative solutions to address them, first in the public health world and now in technology. At Syndio, she leads product development for our OpEQ solution, which empowers users to improve equity and diversity within their organizations by ensuring all employees have equitable access to opportunities to advance and be successful. So, hello, Vanessa. I'm glad to have you with me today. Okay, so in today's session, we're going to be focusing on some results we got from a survey. So we run this survey every year. It's called the Workplace Equity Trends Survey, asking practitioners about what they're planning for the year to come. So if you would like to get the full report, you can get it. Michelle is going to drop a link into the chat now. And feel free to review that later. We've got a lot of resources available supporting that report if you want some more information on any of the things that we cover today. Okay, so first, let's talk about the macro environment and how it's impacting workplace equity. So there's this new wave of kind of second generation pay equity legislation that's going across the US. And these include requirements for additional pay transparency. And they take various forms, like needing to include salary ranges on job offers, for example. That's continuing to expand. So the most recent additions to the set of states with these requirements are Hawaii and Illinois. Additionally, there's these new requirements for opportunity transparency. So that requires companies to do things like post any promotions and explain criteria that can drive selection for promotion. So those are coming online in places like Colorado, Illinois, and most substantially in the EU. So there's this law that just passed in the EU that will be transposed and come online in the various member states within the next 5 years. It has a lot of requirements around things like opportunity transparency as well. So combine that with the fact that the job market is a little bit cooler than it was. So we had a historically hot job market kind of as a rebound from COVID. And this is shifting focus at organizations from hiring to retention and internal mobility. And finally, there's more information today than there ever has been in the past on what employees earn. People are more likely to share their salaries. And as such, it's increasingly important that employees feel like they're being treated fairly. And that's what they want. Okay. At the same time, there are some headwinds facing workplace equity programs. And still, we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. One of the results that we were encouraged by is we asked organizations if they felt that their workplace equity programs would remain a priority over the next 24 months. And 2/3 of organizations agreed that they'll remain a priority for at least the next 24 months. And most interesting is in enterprises. So in the largest organizations, 86%. So 5 out of 6 organizations think that their workplace equity programs will remain a top priority going into the next 2 years. Okay, so workplace equity matters. We know that workplace equity is also tricky. We work in the space of workplace equity analytics. So we want to start with a poll. And so this poll is going to ask how much you agree with the following statement. My organization does a good job of measuring the success of our workplace equity initiatives. And you can see the scale here from 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree, 3 being neither agree nor disagree. So please take a moment to fill this in for your organization. How well do you do at measuring the success of your workplace equity initiatives? I'm going to mute and take a sip of coffee while you do this. Okay, let's see the results. Oh, interesting. So here we have few people strongly disagreeing and a lot of people in the middle, right? So either, disagree or agree, but nobody out of the 41 responses strongly agreeing. Lots of people kind of in that 2 to 4 range, somewhat disagree to somewhat agree. Really interesting. This maps what we saw in the survey as well. So our survey was about 400 respondents in HR, total rewards, and DE&I. And we had 15% of those respondents strongly agree, with the balance of the 85% falling either at somewhat agree or below, with a substantial portion disagreeing with that statement as well. So what this means is that it's not just you, it's everybody. All of us see room for improvement in how we measure the success of our workplace equity programs. Okay, we're going to transition a little bit and talk about this other thing that we learned, which is, where are these programs going in the future? And I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa to talk about this first characteristic that we see.
Great, thanks, Chris. So one of the first things that we saw in the results of the survey is that when we think about workplace equity in the future, we're really looking at evaluating the entire employee life cycle. And if we can go to the next slide, we can see why that is. So it's no longer enough to focus only on pay equity, because equal pay for equal work is really just the beginning. To achieve real workplace equity, organizations need to think about all aspects of the employee life cycle and experience, because all of these moments are interconnected. So you can see that represented nicely here, from recruiting to hiring to career advancement to when employees leave the organization. Every piece of this cycle introduces opportunities for inequities to be introduced, and also opportunities for them to be corrected, which will ultimately improve employee experiences and outcomes for the organization. And if we go to the next slide, we see that it's really critical to analyze for bias at key moments throughout the employee lifecycle. And we've seen many of our customers here at Syndio go through this journey. So maybe you start with a pay equity analysis and then realize that you still have a pay gap. So that might lead you to want to analyze your representation to understand where employees sit within the organization. And then maybe that analysis is going to highlight for you a lack of women in leadership roles, which is then going to lead you to analyze whether women have equitable access to opportunities to be promoted into those more senior positions. So, we can sort of keep peeling back this onion, and ultimately it's going to give us a more holistic view of what's really going on within an organization and more visibility into where you can target your efforts to realize improvements. And we can see on this next slide that one of our survey respondents captured this point really succinctly. They said the list of interdependencies is very long for workplace equity work. If you update one piece, it has upstream and downstream impacts. So this isn't new information to any of us. Organizations are really complex systems. And so no set of employee actions or experiences is going to exist in a vacuum. So when we think about workplace equity, we need to be thinking about all of those pieces and how they relate to one another and what that means for the overall experience within our organization. So as Chris mentioned, we love analytics. So just wanted to get a quick pulse from all of you. What aspects of workplace equity are your organizations currently analyzing? So if you could just take a quick second to drop that in the chat, or sorry, in the poll. And I'll give you just a quick minute to answer that question. And feel free to select more than one from this list. All right. So awesome. So we're seeing a real wide variety among responses here. What's really cool is some folks on the call are measuring everything on this list. So each one of these things is being measured by at least one person on the call. And not too surprising, we're seeing that pay equity is the most common response here. That's something that organizations have been thinking about for a long time, and it's really embedded into a lot of organizational processes. But we're looking at hiring, we're thinking about performance, we're thinking about promotions. So this is great. So I'm going to hand it back to Chris, and he's going to put this into context in terms of what we heard in the survey around this same topic.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah. So in the survey, we asked a couple of questions. What's the second characteristic of these programs? They proactively analyze and identify root causes of inequities. And that does require looking at these different stages of the employee lifecycle. So we'll take a look at the survey results here. And here we did split our surveys into two categories. So we ask another question later in the survey, which is similarly to the one that we did earlier, agree to disagree with a statement that is, my organization does a good job at building diverse teams at each level of our organization. And then we split the respondents based on those who said that they did a good job at this, so agree or strongly agree, and those that disagree, that they don't believe that they do a good job at building diverse teams at each level. And then we split to see, okay, well, what do those effective organizations do differently than ineffective organizations? So the effective organizations here are those green bars, and then the gray bars are the ineffective organizations with respect to building diverse teams at each level. And what you can see is that effective organizations are more likely to run analyses for each of these employment outcomes: hiring, attrition or retention, employee engagement, performance, and potential assessments as well. Similarly, actually, the kind of rank of which of these analyses are most common was right on with what we saw in the webinar survey as well. Right. So pay equity is the most common, followed by hiring. We didn't ask pay equity in this question because it kind of fit in a different section of the survey. But the overall takeaway here is that organizations analyze all parts of the employee lifecycle, and effective organizations are much more likely to analyze things, particularly performance and potential assessment. So we want to talk a little bit about how these employment processes are interrelated too. So we're going to focus in on one in particular for a little while, which is performance analysis and potential analysis. So there's some research that came from the economists Alan Benson, Danielle Lee, and Kelly Shu. And this is from their independent research. So this is an analysis that they conducted of outcomes in a large organization that does 9-box ratings, right? So they're both evaluating performance and potential. And what they found was that women were, on average, received higher performance ratings, but they received lower potential ratings than men. In fact, there's this one category, which is high performance, low potential, where women were much more likely to be bucketed than men. And that had consequences for those women. Specifically, as a result, they were 13% less likely to be promoted than men. And that was because of that difference in the potential ratings that they received. And so what I want you to take away from this research is, there are consequences when there are inequities in one of our processes. And there are also reasons, right? So when we have a difference in promotion rates, there's something that happened beforehand that was leading to that difference in promotion rates. So it may not be that narrow process is biased against women. It may be that there's bias happening further upstream in the process that is impacting the observed difference in promotion rates. And we see this in our off-EQ solution too. So Vanessa, I'll kick it back over to you to talk about what that looks like and how organizations can control for those intersecting factors.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So for companies that rely on performance and or potential ratings to inform their promotion decisions, it's especially important to apply analytical rigor to that process to ensure those ratings aren't either introducing new bias into that promotion analysis or masking bias that's already present in that promotion data. So we can see here an example of a performance rating being used as a control in a promotions analysis. So the context here would be that this organization believes that performance and time and role in this example are drivers of promotion. And so they're controlling for those in that analysis. But what we can see here is that the results indicate that performance is indeed a driver of promotion decisions. And so when our customers see a result like this, we really encourage them to consider taking that next step and analyzing the performance ratings themselves to determine whether or not any inequities are present in that data. If they do that analysis and no inequities are discovered, then that's awesome. So that's good for employees and good signal that the organization can feel confident in using performance as an input to promotions. However, if we run that analysis and inequities are uncovered in the performance or potential process, then that may call into question the validity of using performance or potential as an input to promotion decisions. So from an analytical perspective, that might mean not using performance as a control when analyzing promotions. And from an organizational perspective, it may mean reevaluating the performance rating process itself and the role that it's playing in the promotion process if it's potentially perpetuating bias. And I'll hand it back to Chris. He's going to talk about an example related to pay.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so we also know that performance can be related to compensation. So frequently, your performance rating is directly tied to the merit increase that you receive each year. What you're seeing here is a screenshot from our pay equity software, PayEQ. This is in Pay Policy Analytics. But basically, it's showing that, yes, performance scores are driving compensation. So the higher your performance score, the higher your compensation, with each step correlating with a roughly 4.5% increase. But this is also showing that impact is not the same for women and men. It's almost the same. This bar chart is kind of highlighting the difference. But if you look at the scale, you can see that the difference is about 0.25%. So men get a little bit of an extra boost in compensation for higher performance than women in this organization. So the overall takeaway from this section is you want to be proactive about your analyses, and then you want to think about connections between the employment processes and how differences in performance ratings, for example, might relate to differences in compensation or differences in promotion rates down the line. Okay. Next, what's the next thing that we noticed about workplace equity programs of the future? It's that they have the resources they need. And that can be a dedicated budget. It can be programmatic resources or headcount, but it ensures that they're able to follow through based on anything that they discover in their analyses of employment processes. So we're going to zoom in on pay equity analyses here. And so the question we have for you is, do you maintain a budget specifically for pay equity related salary adjustments? So select yes if you have a budget line item. That can be a dedicated budget, or it can be part of another compensation budget that you tap into for pay equity adjustments. The no options are no, but we want one, or we plan to have one, and then no, and we don't have a plan for pay equity adjustments. We do have a do not know option as well if you're not close to the pay equity program at your workforce. Okay, so I'll just give a moment. I'll take another sip of coffee while y'all respond about the budget that you have for pay equity adjustments should you identify issues that arise. Okay, it's always so exciting to see data coming in real time. Okay, so 23% of you say you have a budget line item you can tap into for pay equity adjustments. The same number don't know, so maybe aren't as close to the pay equity program. And I'm seeing the plurality, so the largest percent of people don't have a budget for pay equity remediation and don't have a plan for one. It's really interesting. When we asked this question in the survey, we did another cut. So we asked organizations about how mature their pay equity programs or their workplace equity programs are. That would include pay equity remediation as well. And we find that the most mature programs, so say those that responded that, yeah, our workplace equity program is up and running, we have what we need, it's just about maintaining the program that we have in place. 94% of those mature programs have a budget specifically for pay equity analyses, or a multi-purpose budget that they can use for pay equity analyses. Less mature programs are much less likely to have budgets for pay equity remediation. But overall, you should have a plan, right, that allows you to, if you notice a gender or race-based discrepancy in compensation that cannot be explained by neutral job-related factors, the right approach is to change compensation. And if you know that that's what you're going to need to do, it makes sense to have budget applied for it. Across all of our customers, we see that organizations typically have pockets where they need to make pay equity adjustments based on analysis. It can be a game of whack-a-mole, right, where problems crop up year after year based on compensation decisions. But generally, this sort of budget set aside or budget carve out is a good way for organizations to address those issues if and when they arise. I'll show on our next slide, we'll show another screenshot from PayEQ. This is our pay equity remediation software. And this kind of has the full suite, right? From grouping your employees and applying controls and thinking about what are the drivers of compensation, to if you notice a gender or race-based discrepancy in compensation. So you can see one in this group in our demo data. What would it cost me to make it so that difference in compensation was no longer statistically significant? And which individuals from that impacted community, so in this case, it was women who were paid less than men, which women should receive adjustments to their salaries so that we can remediate this difference that we observed in our data based on gender. So kind of zooming back out, the same principle applies for other workplace equity issues that could arise as well. But basically, you want to make sure that your workplace equity program has the resources that you need to follow through based on the results of any analysis that you conduct. All right, this brings us to our last characteristic of the workplace equity program of the future, and that's that they share relevant information with both business leaders and employees. So we'll start talking about business leaders here. In our survey, we did the same sort of cut between mature and less mature organizations. And we found that less mature organizations were much more likely to restrict diversity reports to the C-suite only. And they were more likely to not share those results with anybody in the organization, even top brass, right? And so why is this important? Well, if you want the business to support workplace equity, you need decision makers in the business to know whether issues exist and to be able to track their progress, right? What it gets measured gets improved. And so this is why we see more mature organizations sharing more demographic information about the organization deeper into company leadership and management. And this allows leaders and managers to take action that can support the company's long-term goals as they relate to workplace equity. And we have this feature built into OpEQ, which is our opportunity equity software as well, where you can get that granularity. Vanessa.
Great. Yeah. So in OpEQ, one of the things that we help organizations do is examine their representation of women, BIPOC employees, whatever their question of interest is, relative to the talent that's available to them internally and externally. And so examining benchmarks in this visual way really helps to paint the picture of what's going on in an organization and makes the information easier to share and to understand by a variety of different stakeholders. So you can see in this example, we're benchmarking the representation of women in a hypothetical engineering team against their external market availability. And so this allows us to pinpoint exactly where we have gaps. So you can see here that we're looking good at a lot of the levels, but something's going on at that director level. And so we might want to take a closer look and understand why we're not seeing the representation of women there that we would have expected. And a finding like this and this type of visual representation could easily be shared with engineering leaders to help drive accountability to make improvements in this area over time, and also help inform the development of a targeted action plan. So you don't have to target, the entire organization as a whole if you're seeing that you only have an area or an opportunity at one level within the organization. So your resources can be better prioritized and better allocated.
Great. Yeah, and it's not just about sharing with business leaders, like what are the opportunities that we face, where are we doing well as it relates to diversity and workplace equity, and where could we improve? It's also employees. So employees are asking questions, they're curious. There are social factors that are really changing the way that employees think about their organization's responsibilities as it comes to, as it relates to issues of workplace equity. And communicating with employees proactively can build trust. There's also this compliance piece. We kind of touched on that earlier, where there's new laws that require additional transparency from organizations. But an organization that proactively communicates with employees builds trust with those employees. So we talk about this in terms of pay explainability. So why are you paid what you're paid? But then also opportunity explainability. Why are certain people getting promoted and others not? What can you do to increase your odds of being promoted? And what we have are some stats here from a Gartner study. So basically, they looked at when organizations do a good job of educating employees about how pay is determined, right? What are the factors that drive pay? When organizations do this, they build trust in employees. So trust in the organization increases by 10%. And perceptions of pay equity, meaning that they're being treated fairly without regard to gender, race, or other identity characteristics, increases by 11%. So it's not just about communicating with your business leaders, it's about communicating with the employees and the human capital in your organization to ensure that they have the understanding to really trust the processes that are determining their pay and their future at the organization. Okay, so we went through and talked about all these characteristics of these leading organizations. So what can you do? What would I love for you to take away? And this, I think these really apply regardless of where your organization is at in terms of the maturity of your workplace equity program. So first, Vanessa shared these really great visuals of the entire employee lifecycle. What I would do is I would sit down with my working team and I would say, like, okay, this is the employee lifecycle. Where do we have issues that we know about? Where do we have blind spots in terms of analyses that we're not conducting or things that we haven't looked into in the past? And where do we have connected processes? So we see that the degree to which those employment processes are connected, it varies from organization to organization. It can be really explicit and clear, and they might be kind of softer connections as well. So first, do this kind of audit of what you know about your organization and which are the most important processes for you to dig into first. Okay, next, we're going to build a business plan, and this can be multi-stage. So you don't need to have to go from 0 to 60 and build the best possible workplace equity program. In some ways, I wouldn't recommend that, because if you conduct all these analyses at once, you may end up with a lot of things to do that outstrip your organization's ability to take action against each of those findings, right? So build a multi-stage business plan that details what you're going to need, both in terms of technology, in terms of headcount, and other programmatic resources. And this can be prioritized based on what you learned from that audit in the first step, right? So first, we're going to look at the employee lifecycle, understand what are our biggest opportunities, and then we're going to build a business plan that allows us to get to this future state where we're going to have a really robust workplace equity program. Okay, finally, organizations are different, right? And your organization may have more or less appetite or demand for transparency than other organizations do. So this is really a question for HR and company leadership, right? So what is the right level of transparency for us to have with management and employees? And I think the key factors here are we want to be consistent with our employer brand, right? We want to build trust with our employees, and we want to ensure that we're sharing actionable information with leaders and managers at the level where they can actually take the action that we need to get the workplace that we want in the future. Okay, so those are three key, hopefully clear takeaways that I'd love for you to have from the webinar. First of all, take a look at the entire employee lifecycle, build a multi-stage plan that allows you to get to where you want to be in terms of workplace equity, and then have a conversation with leadership and HR to determine, okay, what's the right path for us, and how much do we want to be communicating with business leaders and employees to build the trust that we want. And that is it for our content. So thank you so much for joining us. Vanessa, thank you for being here. We have plenty of time for Q&A, so we do ask that you put your questions into the chat. As I mentioned earlier, there are we'll follow up if we don't get to your questions. I think we have enough time that we should be able to get to all the questions that come up today. But if you want your question answered and we don't get to it today, make sure that you include your name so that we can follow up afterwards. Okay, I'm seeing one question. I'm kind of working through the chat first. I saw a question from Cassandra. Is there a benchmark for the size of the remediation budget? This is a great question. So generally, we see organizations reserve about 0.25% to 0.5% of their merit increase budget for pay equity remediations, or base pay even. But it really depends on how far along, how long your pay equity program has kind of been languishing, right? So there's another Gartner study that shows that for each additional year that you put off pay equity remediation, the cost of remediation, the cost of remediation increases by something like $460,000 per year, right? So it's hard to know. It really depends on your organization size, but I would generally say like, hey, let's start. If it's our first time, we can be aggressive and we can set aside 1% of payroll. Maybe that's just a portion of the merit increase budget, or we can be more conservative and do 0.25% or 0.5%. Great question. Okay, I see with the Supreme Court affirmative action decision, do you see more employers remediating statistically significant gaps when the majority group is the one needing adjustment? Okay, that's a great question. So there are a couple of macro things going on in this question I think we can talk about, but this is really a pay equity issue. Although I guess it could be for other issues like performance or promotions as well. But basically, there's a Supreme Court decision related to affirmative action in the context of universities, right? So basically, the court, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer, but the court found that these organizations couldn't discriminate based on race for student admissions. And it was a couple of universities that this was found. So one of the questions that came out of this was, okay, well, what's going to happen to employers, right, in the private sector? Because employers also have affirmative action obligations. If you're a federal contractor, you have to come up with affirmative action plans to work with the federal government. And so this question is, okay, so we know that the law is written in a way where it's race and gender neutral, right? So it's not, I can't pay women less than men, but it's also unlawful for me to pay men less than women because they're men, right? And so this question is about, all right, do we see more people? Because it's always been kind of tricky in these cases where the impact is in the opposite direction of what you would expect based on historical patterns of advantage and disadvantage. Okay, all of that is like context just to say this is a really good question. The short answer is, I don't know. We've always had a mix of customers. So some customers have remediated regardless of which class is impacted. And some organizations have prioritized impact based on lines of historical advantage and disadvantage in the workplace. I think that remains true today. And I personally haven't noticed a trend of people changing their remediation patterns. I will say that people are more concerned and they're really tracking this and wondering what the impact is going to be in the private sector. Okay. Vanessa, I'm looking for one. Is there anyone in these question sets that you want to take?
Yeah, there was a really great question about the benchmarking example that we showed that I'd love to talk through. So the question had asked on the engineering benchmarking example, why was the VP level okay, while the director level noted with a red X was not okay? It looked like both fell short of the benchmark. This is such a good question. So the reason that one of those groups showed up as red, which in this case means that it's statistically significant, is because we're running a statistical analysis on that comparison. So we're not just looking at, did you potentially fall short of the benchmark? In most analyses, you're going to not hit a benchmark exactly. You're going to see that one group is more or less likely to be promoted, for example. But what we're really asking within the Syndio platform is, does the data suggest that this is possibly due to chance? Or do the data indicate that this is likely due to gender, race, ethnicity, or some other sort of underlying cause? And so in the benchmarking example, when we run the statistical analysis and we take into account the size of the group, that will let us know whether this is a statistically significant result. So in this particular example, what was happening was that VP and SVP group is very small. There were only 17 employees in that group. And so with such a small group, we can't really rule out the possibility that the failure to reach the benchmark is due to random chance. Whereas when we were looking at that director group, there were 46 employees in that group. And so with that group size and the percentage of women occupying those positions, the data would suggest that this is likely not due to random chance. And this is an area where we would want to look because the gap is likely due to the fact that these are women.
Okay. Next is this question of how frequent should pay equity analyses be? Pre-comp and then post-comp cycle, or more frequent than that? So this is a great question. Pay equity analyses, this is one of the findings from the last time that we ran this survey, is that leading organizations do more frequent pay equity analyses. So historically, kind of one per year has been normal. So an organization taking a look at gender, race, or other protected class-based impacts kind of during the annual review cycle, and then they can roll in pay equity adjustments. What we found is that this more proactive monitoring of pay decision-making, but then also of pay outcomes, is associated with lower remediation costs and more responsive organizations. So we are seeing people layer in kind of mid-year checks that allows them to plan for the future, or potentially do a mid-year adjustment, or doing 2 or 3 checks per year. But yeah, I would say at a minimum, you want to be doing a pay equity analysis at least once a year and remediating. So I like that pre and post comp cycle. But I think it's prudent for organizations to do it more frequently. This allows them to identify issues as they crop up. We have another solution called Pay Finder, which allows you to embed kind of pay equity best practices in every compensation decision that you make for new hires or promotions or transfers. And that ensures that you're not going to have a pay equity issue arise based on those decisions that you're making at the margin. Okay. Oh, here's a question. How is potential calculated? Thanks for bringing that up, Michelle. Vanessa, you want to talk about that, how potential, because I know you've thought a lot about potential and performance and how those ratings are done.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've seen is that some organizations are evaluating performance on its own. And so that might be with a rating and a written evaluation, or only one of those two. Some are evaluating potential on its own. And so that would be asking a question around, where do you see this employee going in the future? Are they, higher potential relative to other employees, et cetera? And then some organizations look at those two combined. The most common manifestation of that is the 9-box, where you're looking at performance on one axis and potential on the other. So when we think about measuring potential, I think the thing that we see be most common is either falling into one of those 9-box categories. So where you've been rated high, medium, or low on the potential axis, or actually getting a rating similar to what you typically see in a performance rating. So maybe you have a 1 to 5 scale or a 1 to 3 scale or something like that. And using those two in combination can give you a more nuanced view of the value that somebody's bringing to the table today and the value they could contribute in the future. Just, of course, with that caveat that Chris had noted from the research, suggesting that women in particular are often evaluated differently along those two dimensions. So just really important if you're going to take a look at both of those things to make sure that you're examining the rigor that's behind each of those and making sure that your managers are really well equipped to understand exactly what it is that you're asking there, and that they're calibrated to be evaluating all employees through the same rubric to make sure that no particular employee set is being negatively affected by that process.
Yeah, that's great. One of my favorite findings from that research, right, is that women that got low potential ratings, some of them were still promoted, right? So maybe based on just business need, we need to backfill a position or something. So even though these women received low potential ratings, in the past, they still received promotions. And one of the things that they found was that they outperformed those expectations, right? So there's no really great way of measuring potential, but we kind of know that it exists, right? Some people we think will do really great in management roles, some people won't. And so typically we see managers and leaders assigning values to people. Okay, great. Lorena has a question. How are companies using parameters beyond gender to measure pay equity gaps? For example, performance, years of experience, potential, etc. I'm trying to think of the right way to answer this. So generally those other criteria, so performance, years of experience, potential, location, roles and responsibilities. Sometimes there's even shift differentials, right? So maybe you get an extra pay bump for working a swing shift or a night shift relative to those that work normal, so kind of standard business hours. So those generally fall in this category of neutral job-related factors that drive compensation. And outside of gender, it's totally okay to include those factors. And so a couple of things I would note is that, first of all, that's what pay equity analysis includes. Generally, the first step is you're going to group employees that do similar work. The second step is you're going to apply those neutral job-related factors that can explain compensation. And then should explain compensation the same for men as it does for women, or the same for white employees as it does for Black employees. So that's kind of what a pay equity analysis includes. And that's the most common use that we're seeing there. Vanessa showed that really great example from OPIQ, where we're seeing performance as a potential driver of promotion. So performance ratings influencing the likelihood that someone gets promoted in the future as well. So it's really important to think about how those things are connected. The other point I would make is you may have a pay equity issue that's driven by performance factors. And if you just keep solving that pay equity issue, but you never take a look at why performance ratings are so different between those different groups, you may get the same issue again and again and again, right? So it's like I don't know, bailing out water in a sinking boat, right? Like if you're not plugging the hole, you're going to be bailing out water forever. And so I would say, first of all, yes, you want to identify the root cause of the issue. That can mean applying these other factors as statistical controls. Additionally, there are just issues that may not be in your company's control, such as the types of people that take swing shifts or night shifts versus others. But other things may fall within your company's control as well. Okay, I've got an anonymous question. My company has a pay equity budget, which managers distribute during our annual merit campaign, which is good from an efficiency perspective. However, we struggle in getting managers to shift their mindset to decouple pay equity and merit. Great. From your experience, how common is this, and any guidance on how to overcome? We have pushed for having 2 separate campaigns to mitigate, but we're unsupported by HR leadership. Yeah, this is I think you're not alone, anonymous attendee, in having this issue. So we talked about this a little bit on the webinar. I think the question teed it up really well, but basically, okay, we're going to do pay equity adjustments during the merit cycle. And when we do that, what can happen, and I've seen this play out before, I think that it's probably the issue that you're describing, but say that employee X is getting a 5% increase due to a pay equity adjustment. So when the manager sees that, they might be like, okay, well, you know, they're great. They're getting a 5% increase already. That's good enough. I don't need to give them any more of my merit increase budget because they're already getting a 5% increase. And I would rather give it to these other people who are also doing a really good job. And I just have a limited number of dollars to spend. So this is not what you want, right? So you don't want a pay equity adjustment to take the place of a merit increase. And in fact, it can kind of recreate the problem that you had before, right? So if you give pay equity adjustments to resolve a gender-based issue, but then none of those people that received pay equity adjustments receive merit increases, you may have just recreated the pay equity issue by that kind of reverse allocation of merit dollars. So one option, and it sounds like you tried this, is to split those processes out entirely. Here are a couple other things that you might try. One is I've seen those pay equity increases get preloaded into the system. So if I am, well, say the other way around, if Vanessa is my manager, rather than seeing my current compensation, when she goes into the merit increase cycle, she might see my compensation that's inclusive of that pay equity adjustment already. So although it's included in the merit cycle, it's no longer visible, or it's kind of not anchored in Vanessa's mind in the same way that it would be if she saw like, okay, well, Chris gets 5%. So whatever I'm giving him for merit is going to be on top of that 5% after the pay equity adjustment. So you can kind of hide it beneath the fold by preloading it into the system. Another thing I've seen organizations do is add the pay equity adjustment onto the back end. So managers go through and they make their merit increase allocations based on how employees are doing and where they fall in the range. And then the pay equity adjustment happens after the fact. And so in that way, it's also added on to the merit cycle. So I think those are different ways to approach the same thing that you're describing, which is you don't want pay equity adjustments to crowd out merit increases for those folks in particular. Those are a couple other things you might try. Okay. I think that's it for questions that we have. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. So thank you so much for the time and for joining us today. And please check out the Workplace Equity Trends Report for a full description. If you would like a one-on-one demo of Syndio's workplace equity platform, which includes PayEQ, our pay equity software, and OpEQ, which ensures opportunity equity at your organization, including things like representation benchmarking and checking for equity in performance or promotion rates, you can sign up for a demo at syndio.com/demo. Michelle just dropped that link into the chat. But otherwise, thank you so much for the time today and for your really attentive questions. It was a real pleasure. Vanessa, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Always a pleasure. Yep.